Chapter 9. When All Gets Desperate. Dib tossed and turned all night, sometimes muttering and sometimes groaning despite the comfort of the bed and the stillness of the room. Only a single breeze stirred the loose curtains and a silvery slice of moon gleamed upon the nightstand. But within Dib's head, things weren't so peaceful. There was an instant of wire, shining and vital, strung across green flesh as cords of metal sunk deep into soft tissue. The screen submerged into celestial pink light as Zim came towards him in the dark, grinning his malefic grin. From his neck hung the glowing glass vial. Dib flew awake, freeing himself from the carousel of visions before they drowned him completely. He sat up in bed, breathing deep, scared witless for no reason. His skin was marbled in cold sweat. The room was dark, and the clock on the nightstand read 5 o'clock a.m. Dib reached for his glasses and slipped them over his nose. The dark world of his room swam into steady focus. He slipped off the bed, wearing nothing but his boxers, and left the room, using the narrow beams of moonlight to guide him down the landing and into his study as he rubbed sleep from his eyes. From there, he flicked the light switch and the room brightened into a gold sharpness that hurt his eyes. Barely waiting for his eyes to focus to the light, he shambled forwards and ripped open the drawers of his desk. Amongst the junk was a spare house key, what he'd been looking for earlier to give to Clara. He picked this up and placed it on the desk with some satisfaction, but it was not what he was really looking for at 5 in the morning. Dib dived back in, doubly determined, shifting pencils and USB sticks aside until he exposed a cold pink glow emanating from within. He reached in further and drew it out. Hanging from a bit of broken chain was a pink vial. Dib had not looked upon it for decades. The shaft felt like it was made out of glass, while within a liquid substance sloshed around inside. Just looking at it brought back vivid memories. Memories he had abolished and left to sink to the far reaches of his mind where everyone hid their bad experiences. He supposed that hiding it in his drawer would relieve him of the past and somehow blot out the guilt. Guilt he knew he shouldn't have felt. But he did, because he was human. Zim had accidentally dropped it during the struggle in the wire, fighting for his life. Dib saw it glistening under the vigilance of the sun and had scooped it up, believing it to be some tool for future world annihilation. But he never did decipher it. The vial was certainly too precious to break, and its liquid contents would melt his skin off for all he knew. And he had never returned it. Presumably Zim had forgotten all about it. He'd been doing that a lot lately. Forgetting. Dib dumped it on his desk, watching it glow for a few beats before heading off to bed. He was done with the nightmares. Zim scanned the shelves, looking for the same Joynese cream he bought every week. It was the only one that not only worked, or seemed to work at least, but did not cause a malignant skin rash like some others he had tried. However, the product he needed was always at least 2 shelves too high for him to reach. This caused radical issues. He couldn't even push a trolley, for the handlebars were too far up, so he had to contend with the dirty shopping baskets. The supermarket was busy at this time of night, which irked the small Urkin. He liked to shop at night because there were less people around to annoy him, but tonight was not that night. Kids were in circles around their parents, oftentimes screaming for sweets or attention or just for screaming's sake, while old people bumbled around, taking ages to pick a certain product while holding up everyone in the aisle. Often Zim got stared at, not usually by the adults, but by the children. They were immediately perplexed by his shortness and his skin color, and Zim had to put up with their taunting and confused stares. Sticking his tongue out at them only provoked their interest, so he tried to keep his shopping trips short. Another reason he liked a quiet supermarket was because he was able to activate his pack legs and swoop something from far up on a shelf he would not otherwise have reached. But if there were people around, he would have to wait until no one was looking. This he did with great care, fearing the day when his actions would get noticed. Swiping the ointment into his basket with his metal strut, he secreted it away again into his pack and continued shopping. All he needed was the cream and pig oil. Pig oil, he'd discovered, could be used as a cheap substandard for fuel. If his journey in the Voot was quite lengthy, he needed as much as the cruiser could carry. With his basket full, he proceeded to the checkouts when he caught a bemusing sight. Dib was at the produce aisle, looking at the apples. Zim was about to head on over, hoping to startle him from behind, when Clara approached the human first. They then held hands, and he watched Clara reach up to kiss his human. Resentment spiked Zim deeply. Dib was his human, his play toy, his pet, his victim. He wanted to whip out an Urkin plasma gun and shoot them right there and then, not for 1 minute caring about the aftermath. Acceptance was never an easy thing, and all Zim had known, other than his own personal struggles on an enemy planet, was the Dib. But he had made a promise to the human, and so murder was not, and could never be, his objective. He kinda wished he had somehow been able to avoid that wire trap, or at least rip out his own antenna among other things, just to avoid complications such as the oath. But he had heard of Urkins dying for damaged or detached antennas, so maybe it wouldn't have been such a good idea. It wasn't even worth thinking about it. Just imagining the wires restraining his chest and neck made him massage his throat in memory before tightening up again in his current predicament. He turned to go. What did it matter? He intended to leave for good and return to his ilk. But he found that every time he thought about it, he felt a certain bitter reluctance. He smacked the emotion to one side before it could grow. He was a proud Urkin soldier who would serve once again. Maybe the box of dead Urkins the Tallest had sent him was merely a test of his faith, leading him to this very moment of preparation. Pondering this, and feverishly wandering down the aisle with no clear direction, he bumped into Clara, causing him to drop his basket. 2 tins of pig oil and 1 bottle of joint cream went rolling across the linoleum floor. It did not help that he went into a coughing fit at the same moment. It was so grueling that he was forced to shut his eyes and double up, feeling his head fog up with darkness. "Gosh, I'm so sorry!" Claire started picking up his stuff. Recovering from his episode, he just stood watching her nervously, unsure how to act, and he was without the dib. To him, Clara was nothing special, just another dirt monkey with a stupid brain. After picking up the last item, she handed it to him with a beaming smile. "Good to see you again, Zimmy." "It's Zim," he said, trying not to snap too harshly at her. Dealing with one terrible nickname was quite enough. He would not tolerate two. "Oh, I'm sorry. Are you okay?" When Zim just stood there like a shy 3-year-old, she added, "That cough sounds pretty nasty, like it's gotten to your chest. Here, I bought this up for you. I have the receipt." And she handed him a dark glass bottle. When he took it from her, he found that it was quite heavy. "Bought it from the chemist. It's cough medicine." "I don't need such filth," he said, and then realized it was not what she might want to hear. "Oh, yes, thank you, human that is, Clara. I shall grease it over my hands?" No, you drink it. Just follow the instructions." He honestly didn't want it. For all he knew, it was poison, and that she'd preordained all of this. "She knows I'm an Urkin soldier, set to conquest this miserable fucking planet. This cough medicine is her master plan. I must fool her somehow and dispose of it, thwarting her once and for all." "Thank you, I will," he said, pasting on a fake grin. "Anywho, I must be off now. I have much to do." And he took the basket and ran as if he was on fire. Clara watched him go, perplexed. While the wind howled, bringing with it the smell of rain, Zim was slinging things into the cargo hold of his voot in the roof of his home. The cargo hold wasn't very big, but it had just about enough room for food rations, extra containers of fuel, and oxygen tanks. He had to make sure that he had enough to last him a 6 to 9 month trip, while he remained ignorant to the fact that his biological shell wouldn't make it that far. The cough medicine Clara had bought for him he had thrown into the trash can outside without further thought. "Computer, run basic diagnostics for the voot runner, and initiate all preliminary functions."
"Yes, master."
He wouldn't say any goodbyes to Gurr or to the dib. Urkins were not nostalgic or wistful, or cogitated on the past. They were singular-minded and purposeful, focusing preliminary on the present and future. He would miss Gurr, he could not help that, and he would do his best to ignore it. As Zim worked, disconnecting the umbilicus systems around the voot, he ignored the fact that he was starting to see double in one eye. He ignored the fact that he was often losing his balance, and he ignored the fact that his heart was starting to race at the most unusual of times, even when he was relaxing. The old soldier in him knew this was the right way to go about things. If the upgrade wasn't coming to you, you would go to the upgrade, and it was rightfully his. Every invader deserved it. Only janitorial Urkins, slaves, and defectives did not. Part of him, too, was looking forward to the prospect of being restored and welcomed back into the fold. It was his calling, his destiny. But another part of him quailed at this opportunity. He kinda liked Earth. He kinda liked his life here. As he softened up as he aged, he had started to back down. But of course, such thoughts were blasphemous. Some may even say forbidden. Earth had made him weak, and he didn't want to be weak.
"Diagnostics complete. Left auxiliary turbine needs replacing before preliminary functions can begin," said the computer.
Fine. Zim opened the back panel to get at the turbines that controlled the rear engines. However, in order to do the repairs, he also had to fight against his own condition. His claws shook badly, and his ministrations were clumsy. He was misjudging distances and often lost his grip on things or failed to align components into their proper slots. He recognized the corrosion of his fine motor skills, and he knew it was down to his pack. There was precious little he could do about it, and he knew he just had to press on. However, after a 30-minute job that should have only taken him 12, he backed up against a stack of boxes, lurching into fiery coughs that caused his whole body to painfully spasm. It forced him down to his knees, cupping both hands to his mouth. He could barely get in a snatch of breath between each bout. When his lungs finally started to work again, he lowered his claws to find them covered in flecks of green fluid. Ugh! Disgusting! He immediately produced a bar of cleansing chalk and started frantically rubbing his gloved hands on it, ridding himself of the vile discharge. With a grunt of disgust, he threw it into the garbage pail by the voot.
"Repairs complete. Beginning preliminary functions,"
stated the computer. Exhausted, Zim sat down by the voot. He knew he should be in the cockpit setting up the instruments for the voyage, but he was so weak. If he stood up for long periods, the floor would tilt and his head would get all fuzzy and hot. Was this all to do with his pack? It had to be. He had never suffered pack deliberation before, and he was too afraid to put himself in the autodock to find out exactly what was going wrong with him. As he waited for the computer to do its perfunctory tests, Zim suffered bouts of fierce chills. He huddled where he sat, trembling all over. Little green spots had started to appear on his throat. So absorbed was he in fever that he barely heard the computer notify him.
"Preliminary functions complete. Voot runner is ready for activation."
Excellent. Zim used the stack of boxes for support as he climbed back to his feet on legs that wobbled. He approached the voot and hopped into its cockpit. He went to hit the button to activate the windshield when instead his claw overshot it, hitting the engine button instead. The rear engines ignited and guttering flames of blue shot into the back of the roof. Cursing, Zim tried again, this time hitting the right switches. His grueling coughing fits made it hard for him to concentrate. The windshield enveloped the cockpit and the top of the roof began to open, each side divorcing from the other to create an opening. Then, clutching the throttle, he directed the voot straight up despite the G-force driving him back into his seat. The voot did not stall as it rocketed upwards at 100 miles per hour, but its rider did. Zim blacked out, the force is too much on his weakening body. His limp claws loosened on the throttle and the voot then veered off course, angling to the right. The stabilizers held it in check, but as it leveled off, it was now heading towards the skyscrapers of Lincoln. Proximity warnings began to scream at its unconscious pilot. With a shudder, Zim came to, blinking dazedly. The red flashing lights had little meaning to him at first, for he had no idea where he was.
Proximity alert. Imminent collision,
said the Voot's navigational system.
Please abort current trajectory.
Zim blinked, realization dawning. He grabbed at the throttle with both hands and slammed the Voot into a hard right. The ship's undercarriage scraped the side of an office block. All alarms stopped on account of him avoiding a collision in time. Regardless, the panic, no matter how brief, cost him. He curled into bad coughing fits that produced yet more blood on his lips, hands, and command chair. In the end, he was forced to wrench open the life support hooked to the side of his seat and plant a clear purple mask over his mouth and nose. With one shaking hand, he turned up the valve until he could breathe. The relief was like a cool hand of rescue, and he lay in the cockpit, sucking down oxygen as if he nearly drowned at sea. Forcing himself to breathe deeply wasn't easy, as doing so encouraged heavy coughs, but he got through them, somehow, just to breathe. As the Voot drifted through Earth's atmosphere, he drifted in his mind, strung up in fever and fatigue. As he lay there, connected to his apparatus, he began to wonder if he could even make the trip to his tallest. Getting this far had been a struggle, and he hadn't even breached the atmosphere to enter the vacuum of space. If I can't make it to them. Oh, no. I, Zim, will make it. It's easy. I'll activate the autopilot and just rest all the way there. He wanted to sleep, but he knew he couldn't. He had too many things to do. Zim righted himself slowly to avoid dizziness he was sure would descend if he overtaxed himself even a little, and scooted towards the control panel. He placed his claws around the offensive mask and removed it, breathing in the stale, recycled air of the cabin. Just as he was about to grab the throttle again to take into the atmosphere, his spooch gurgled noisily. Moments later, he was helplessly vomiting all over the controls. His mind was caught between disgust and horror, and he was impotently faced with the truth. He could not fly the Voot. He certainly could not fly it all the way to the Massive. Vomit oozing between his claws as he held them over his mouth, he reached for the controls and set it to autopilot. Home. One option remained to him, but it was an option that degraded him. The Dib. This kind of defeat sent spikes of deep disappointment into him from all sides. The Voot did a sharp U-turn in the night sky before gliding back down, heading for his house in a sea of buildings. The G-forces weren't as bad, and he comfortably rode through the turbulence. The roof of his home was still open. In his haste and absent-mindedness, he'd forgotten to close it. Such an oversight was terrible for an Urkin elite, but this time his pride failed to list the mistake as anything but important. Zim flicked a control with the lazy tip of his claw, setting the Voot into autopilot for landing, even though the maneuver was a simple one he had performed thousands of times before. The computer diligently took over, sweeping the cruiser low and aiming perfectly for its port in the middle of the open roof. Luckily it was dark and there was very little to see, for as Zim peered out his windshield he saw no one walking by. But this relief did not quell the shakes within, for he was gripped in a series of spasms that shook him from the tips of his claws and all along the length of his good antenna. The Voot landed, the computer notifying him of its success. The cruiser's engines expelled its heat, filling the roof with fumes. Zim slammed on the cockpit button a little too hard and the windshield slotted up, allowing freedom. Zim stumbled over the lip of the cockpit and then fell flat on his face on the tube-littered floor. Above him, the roof had fully closed, and the sterile lights of gossamer purple bathed the interior of the attic in a cold shade. Zim lifted himself stiffly to his knees and then to his feet. He shambled to the conduit, his mind in a feverish whirl of confusion. Thoughts came and went, sometimes eclipsing over plans completely. Code 219. Must contact the tallest. Gotta fix Gur. Call the Dib? No, just no. Drink, I need a drink! Code 219. Lost in his ramblings, he hit a button and descended. A few moments later, the door slid aside, revealing his recreation room. He stood in the conduit, his right antenna flickering apprehensively. He had not meant to come here, had he? He never came down here anymore. Even so, Zim saw the black piano standing elegantly in its corner, waiting for him. Zim drew near it almost timidly, as if he was approaching some sleeping beast and not a piano. Playing the piano had always calmed him and helped orientate his energies. Stiffly, he stood by the stool and lifted the panel. The black and white keys gleamed up at him, spotless and clean. Nervously, he hit a key, and a single shrill note pitched the air into a keen sound that spoke to him as clearly as any voice. It gave him chills. Hitting the keys always gave him chills. As an Urkin soldier, it was the one thing he loved, the one thing that could speak to him as clearly as he could speak to the piano. Maybe it was a guilty pleasure soldiers were not deemed to practice, but it was his guilty pleasure. The music sent feelings down his right antenna, and it was sometimes as pleasurable as ecstasy. Having already made up his mind, Zim scooted onto the little stool and glazed over the keys, his claws splayed and ready to begin. He tapped one key, and then another, feeling as much as hearing the music connect to his feeler. As he played, his right antenna stretched forwards to catch every subtle note. His claws began to hit them faster. He played without notes or music books, remembering from memory all the tunes he had ever heard. The rhythm was soft and gentle, building up slowly as he played. 3 of his claws kept to a slow, undulating tune, while his right claws tapped to a higher, more subtle melody. The music was reminiscent of Chopin or Beethoven. As it always did, the music eased his frayed nerves, settled his rebellious spooch, and lessened the terrible shaking. The music gave him control and brought things into a clearer perspective. The piano was an old friend who never judged, never hated, never disappointed. It was always there, needing just a little maintenance now and again to sate Zim's emotions he was not allowed to express in the world. It helped balance his organic brain against that of his pack's programming, and he was able to surface above his indoctrination, if only for a short time. The pace grew faster as his claws began to hammer on the keys, delivering an eager tempo. He was a little out of practice, but he was still able to hit the right keys at the right time, delivering a smooth cadence that was soft and smooth and yet full of sadness. "What are you looking at, Zim? It's a music shop. They sell instruments," Dibbit said when his alien stopped by a shop. "What's that?" Zim pointed. "Oh, that? It's a piano. What's it do?" "It plays music, Zim. Why? You want to drop it over a city or something?" His tempo eased, his claws slowing down. Music was something that was his, something that he could tame and make his own, and yet it would never be unless he strove to make it. When he hit the last key, he sat back on the stool, listening to the fading echoes diminish into the air. Then he leaned back too far, and though he wheeled his arms in the air to keep from falling, he fell anyway, and his pack hit the floor first with an audible smack. Before he was taken completely, he knew by default that the true enemy was his pack. Pre-programmed for certain events, it began to take over his organic brain, willing it to desist as it strapped him in for sleep, a sleep that could last an eternity. The pack was not to know any different, for it only did as it was programmed. Too damaged, too old. And it did as was intended, to put the host to sleep until repairs were to be performed, or until exterior help intervened. But there would be no intervention, and there would be no repairs, but the pack did not know this. Cutting through Zim's instinctive organic needs and drives, it began to drug him, slowing down his tissue function as if it were some malefic god. Zim could feel it, as though wires were lassoing around him and pulling him down. They were as effective as chains, and the more he struggled and pulled, the stronger his pack induced his bloodstream with narcotics. The pack had obviously taken all the damage it could sustain, but no longer. It was putting its host to sleep so that it could protect the last parts worth protecting, like a damaged computer shutting down to protect its hard drive. To Zim, it was death. His consciousness was lured deeper and deeper into a black coma. He tried to fight against the allure, knowing it was the only way to keep himself from going any deeper. His body was falling into a hole, one he would never be able to crawl out from. Mentally, he pushed against the impending sleep, and though it was a mental battle he waged, it felt as physical as a real battle. To the casual observer, Zim was behaving no differently. He lay on his side next to the piano, eyes closed as if in sleep, kicking with his left foot occasionally as if he was menaced by ill dreams. But upon closer inspection, it was clear that this wasn't quite right, and that this was no ordinary sleep. All three of his pack's ports were blinking bright pink as it fought to keep his host under his command. To Zim, it felt like he was wading through mud and thorns as he strove ever forwards. "Wake up!" he was screaming at himself. "Wake up, Zim! Wake up!" The pack was talentless, mindless, yet it was filled with data and corrective treatment. Parts of it no longer functioned, and the damaged area seemed to spread its rot outwards, corrupting what was left. It could no longer regenerate the rotted tissue inside Zim's spooch, and because of this failure, and to arrest the deep spread of septic infection, it had to stupefy its host. But Zim did not understand, could not understand. He had no idea how ill he really was, and he blamed it all on his pack. "Wake up, Fire, wake up! You can't let it win! Fight it! Fight it!" He felt the pack's influence relenting, so he pushed harder. His mind felt like it would fracture under the pressure, but he strained anyway. His organic brain had always been a slave to his pack's needs and influences, binding him to its authority, but the pack was weak too, and if he fought just a little more, he could finally break free of it. Meanwhile, as Zim shivered, kicking out randomly in the air, and sometimes squealing distressfully as he bled sweat, Gur heard him and came over, sitting by him protectively. "Master?" he whimpered, sometimes reaching out to touch him. "Master, wake up! You's having a bad dream! Master?" The pack re-tackled him, sending him further down the darkness of his own abyss. Down there was silence and cold black. He would never again see the light of day. He wanted to detach himself from it, but like the bones in his body, he was married to the device, forever. It contained his memories, his core personality, or so certain teachers said, and the energy for his organs. As much as he knew this, he wanted to rip it out of his body as if it was an evil tumor and bury it. Even if Zim had known the true reason the pack was keeping him comatose, he still would have fought. He felt himself slipping and thought of Gur without a father, his hopeless, retarded child alone in the world for the rest of his days. He could not allow that. He would not. "Wake up!" His scream seemed to resonate, and the pack conceded suddenly, as if drained of power. Zim's eyes flew open, but for a moment he could not move, only breathe in deep, his little lungs troubled by a fitting splutter of coughs. He could smell Gur as much as see him, and though he tried to command his limbs to move so that he could crawl away, he could not. He just lay there, as if glued to the floor. Gur was sitting right by him, doodling on the floor with what was left of his right hand. Andy was humming to himself. When he saw that Zim's eyes were open, a broad grin stretched across his metallic face. "Master, you's woken. Did you knock your head and falls down?" He snatched his tongue back into his mouth, not realizing that it had been hanging out of his lips on the floor. It was as dry as his throat, and it took him several attempts at swallowing before he felt like he could use his voice. "Gur, please, leave me alone." He was terrified of Gur switching into duty mode. He was unable to move his claws, let alone try to dodge if Gur happened to go crazy. He oftentimes wondered what Gur would do after he killed his master. Would he finally have fulfilled his purpose, or would he continue on, switching and going crazy on anything that moved until he was at last stopped by violent means? Was it possible that Gur would go back to normal once his father was out of the game? "You're wet!" Gur then eagerly exclaimed. Yes, Zim was wet from his own icy cold sweat. Energy returned to him in small doses. Panicked by Ger's close proximity, he was able to shore up enough limited strength to draw himself to his elbows, and then to his knees. His pack, the silent antagonist or protagonist depending on how you looked at it, no longer abused him or challenged him. Zim's organic brain had overridden its survival programming, either permanently or for a short time. Even so, because of this slightest victory, there was no longer any protection from the source of infection buried deep within. The last of the thinnest walls in his defense was now gone, and gangrenous bacteria began to permeate his bloodstream and other organs. He sat for a spell, trying to refocus like he was a computer booting up from an overspent power outage. Ger did not move, and remained by his side. "Yous want me to get you something?" the deranged robot child asked at length. "You want me to call Dibby?" "Phone," Zim muttered hazily. "Please, Ger, the phone. Bring it to me." "Okie dokie." He left and tinkered off to another room. Then he returned, carrying a phone in less than 2 minutes. Zim, still kneeling on the floor, shackled in fatigue, accepted it in guarded surprise. Ger showed no signs of his usual aggressiveness, but Zim was not relaxing, though he could do very little to ward off an attack, should it come. The Irkin started slowly dialing the numbers. Each number he pressed seemed to hammer home a nail in his soul, and each nail was a monument of shame and defeat. It hurt him to do this. It hurt him a lot. But he had to survive long enough to fix Ger, and if there was one option open to him, he had to at least consider it before burying it completely. Dib was at home, and taking Clara on a grand tour of the place. The sofa had been newly cleaned, and all green blemishes had gone. In fact, the whole house had gone through a chaotic instance of sudden cleaning. So much so that even the coffee table seemed to gleam under the lights of the crystal chandelier his sister had bought him one Christmas. He wasn't usually a tidy person. All of his UFO magazines and ashtrays had been dumped in a cupboard, all his spare clothes thrown under the bed. He'd even lit a candle in the parlor to try and get rid of the smell of stale cigarettes and coffee. All in all, Clara seemed to be impressed. His house wasn't exactly small and was quite lavish for a man who lived on his own, all thanks to being the son of a highly renowned professor. He didn't possess many objects of character, however. Clara was impressed with American history and interesting topics and books, and Dib had very little taste other than his alien and ghost memorabilia and textbooks. She did like his old blue book on old lullabies, though. She picked it up from the book closet and flicked through the yellow pages, pleased at the find. Dib only smiled nervously. The old book was the one thing that was his mother's, and it was precious to him. "My mother used to read that to me, when I was very little," he said, trying not to sound bitter or hateful about it. Whenever he thought about his mother, he got sad or angry, and he had not meant for her to find the book or take any further interest in it beyond the front cover. But he had to remind himself that if he wanted to share his life with Clara, then he had to be open from the start. Zim had taught him to be defensive, incredulous, and bitter for many years, and he was deciding that losing those life lessons for today wasn't so bad. "It's beautiful. I used to have one just like it, but I lost it." She turned the pages slowly, smiling to herself at old fond memories. "My favorite was Wanderer's Lullaby. I think it was about finding yourself. When I was young, I never could understand it, but my mom read it to me a lot." She put the book down with nostalgic approval and then turned to lay eyes on him. "Dib, you're so sweet. Did you know that?" Dib did not know that. He had lived a life where he had taken insults either from his sister, the bullies at school, or a very obnoxious alien. He had never received a compliment in his life, unless his father happened to be in a good mood and patted him on the head as though he was a dog. He got nervous suddenly, and he found that playing with his fingers was far more interesting than engaging with a female. She walked over and cupped her hands around his, quelling his fidgeting. Then her lips drew near, and he could feel her breath on his mouth. It was the closest he had ever been with a normal human being, and he was terrified. Luckily, he'd had plenty of wine beforehand to help calm him, but he still felt totally unprepared for this moment. He'd been hoping for a kiss a little further down the road, but not so soon. Still, Dib reached forwards to meet her, closing his eyes because he wasn't sure how else to do it. "This is it. This is the moment. I finally get to kiss her. Will I do okay, or will I fuck it up?" Just as they were mere centimeters apart, the phone blared out loudly next to the sofa, causing both of them to startle from the moment. Dib regretfully pulled away from her and looked accusingly at the phone as it blasted them with ugly ringtones. It was 10 at night. Who the hell would be ringing him? "Sorry about that," he said flimsily, even though he knew it wasn't his fault. But it was his phone that broke that precious moment that might have turned into something beautiful. "That's okay," Clara said, still looking eager. "Are you going to answer it?" "No. Let it go to voicemail. Nothing's more important to me than you." Clara decided to sit down on the sofa, exactly where Zim had bled out not more than a week ago. "You have a lovely place." Then she pointed at the various gaming systems beneath his flat-screen TV. "You have all the consoles." "Yeah." The phone quit ringing, and Dib's recorded offhand voice kicked in, requesting to leave a message. But no message was left. In fact, the phone started ringing again, just as loudly. Someone trying to reach him so late at night meant that it might be more important than first perceived. Dib apologized to her and then picked it up, hoping for the sake of the caller that it was important. His tone was as belligerent as his mood. "Yes?" A faint, croaky reply was speaking from the receiver. "Dib, is that you?" "Yes. Who else would it be? And who is this?" "What? Sorry, I didn't quite hear you. Is this the Dib?" "The Dib?" The recollection took a second. "Zim, is that you?" He barely recognized the voice. It didn't sound like the invader at all. Even so, if it was him, he spoke extra loud just in case. "Yes," came an aggravated response as if the alien's mental patience had already been blown. I I may have some need of your ugly assistance, Dibworm. Can you meet me somewhere? Assistance? You're not capturing any more humans, are you? You're too... He was about to say too old, but he had never mentioned Zim's age to his face before, and didn't want to in case it made the invader react badly. No, they stunk too much. The mess they made. Look, no tricks, okay? I just want to speak to you. You are speaking to me. I am? Dib rolled his eyes. Look, Zim, I don't have time for your games right now. I gotta go. See you some other time, maybe. You can't. In mid-sentence, he cut Zim off and put the phone back on its receiver. Before his newfound annoyance could spread any deeper, Clara enticed him to sit beside her on the sofa. Dib smiled, though inside he was a little disappointed with himself for what he'd just gone and done. I promised never to turn my back on him, and I hung up his call. Does that still count? No, of course not. Zim's just jealous. He has no one else to talk to except Gur, so it's only natural he wants to butt in. And Clara, her charm, her everything, made him forget all about the alien and the wire. He didn't want the promise to hold him, as the spider's web held the fly. You can't hang up on me! I hang up on you! The disconnection was so abrupt that it took Zim a minute or two to register it. Once he had, hate filled him like a fast-acting poison and he threw the phone at the floor. It didn't break, but its plastic casing cracked down the middle. The elite snarled, shoving the old Zim, the weak Zim, through the back door. His kneecaps crunched as he rose to his feet, but he ignored it. Curse humans! Curse the oath! He wanted to yank his useless left antenna out of his skull once and for all. Perhaps then he would be free from the past. If he had not fallen into that trap, he would have killed the Dib and hung his fucking entrails from the wall as poachers did to their trophies. His claws clutched at his broken antenna, thinking that he could dislodge it as if he was pulling a weed up from the ground. The Dib made him so mad. It was his fault that he hadn't conquered this part of the galaxy. His fault that he had gotten so soft and old. His fault. His fault. Gur reached up and pulled at Zim's left arm. No, he cried. No, master. What do you know? And he slapped Gur's hand away. I'm surrounded by morons. First the Dib, and then you. Even so, he took his claws away from his antenna. It would have to hang there, broken as always. He supposed cutting it off at the stem with a laser would be about as painful as cutting off an arm or a leg. Perhaps he would even die from it. To distract his wayward thoughts, perhaps, Gur suddenly took out something from his head compartment and shoved it into Zim's face. For yous! I found it sleeping in the garden. Zim smacked it away from him. It was a dead bird. Gur held it up from its broken wing. No! Bad Gur! What did I say about picking up carcasses? They're full of germs. Throw that thing outside and then go back to the TV and gorge yourself on stupid commercials. Off with you! Gur ate the whole bird by dropping it into his mouth as if he was a seal eating a fish, and then he was loudly licking his metal lips and making the most rancid of noises. Using a pack leg, Zim hooked it into the robot's shoulder pad and pushed him into the furthest corner. Get out of here! Zim hoarsely yelled, or I'll lock you in your room! That seemed to do it. Gur burst into floods of tears and threw a tantrum, rolling about on the floor as he sobbed and screamed. Relying on his one exposed pack leg, Zim hooked him up again and maneuvered him over to the conduit. He forcibly shoved him in, and in moments he had hit the button and Gur was sent up to the uppermost levels. Zim finally relaxed, but when he went to retract his pack leg with a telepathic command, the gears jammed for a moment, internal components crunching against each other. The pack leg could not be drawn all the way in, causing about 3 feet of it to hang out of his pack like some flaccid, grotesque limb. He tried again, starting to panic a little. Fuck's sake, he raged. The pack leg finally slipped in at last, sparking as it did so. Then, because he wasn't sure what else to do, he traveled down to the mainframe, sat at the command seat, and stared at the screen. Computer, analyze my pack's efficiency, and make it quick.